According to the chief economist of CIBC, we are in a per capita recession.
We are in a per capita recession. Per capita GDP is down by 3%. Per capita, per person, consumption is down by 2%. So the only reason why the economy is still above water, barely, is because of the fact that we got 1.2 million people into this country last year. I tell you that this is not a way to grow an economy. India also has a lot of people. What we need is to see GDP per capita rising. And if you look at overall GDP, is very close to zero. Housing market is basically in recessionary territory. The housing market is a buyer's market with no buyers.
So why is this happening? How can we look back in history to see a comparable time to this? And how can we look forward and judge and estimate what is going to happen next based on interest rates, based on the Bank of Canada, and based on what Benjamin Tal has been saying with his analysis? Let's get into it. Hi, my name is Adam Nadler. I'm the owner of Vision Real Estate. Thanks so much for tuning in. Again, if you haven't yet, please hit that subscribe button down below this video, and don't forget to like this video so this content can be pushed out to more people like yourself. And if you have any questions about real estate or you want to chat, use the link in the description below. It'll be the first one down there. That'll connect you to a calendar where you can book a time to chat with me at a time that is most convenient for you. Or feel free to just shoot me an email directly to adam@visionrealestate.ca, and I will send you back a custom video response within 24 hours. Jumping right in, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but there are definitely people who study economics and can be right more than they are wrong. Benjamin Tal, in my experience, having watched this market for almost a decade now, is definitely one of those people. So when he speaks, I listen up. And I want to pull some clips from a presentation he did at a REMAX event recently where he's saying that the Bank of Canada has overshot on their tightening cycle, and it is time to reduce interest rates. And before I jump into his video, I do want to back it up with some stats here because, well, I'm a nerd. Just looking at the stats over the last few years, the absolute worst time to sell real estate other than now was right when the pandemic hit in March, April, and May of 2020. Now, if we compare the numbers from back then to now, we can see that in some cases, it's actually even worse now than it was then. Looking at sales volume, we are just barely above what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic when the whole world had shut down and no one was moving anywhere. But if we actually just take the consumption rate as a whole, which gives us a much cleaner read on how the market's doing, we can see that we are at about the same months of inventory that we saw at the very beginning of the pandemic. So although a lot of people were expecting a very busy spring market in 2024, well, it seems the piper's demanding to get paid with high interest rates for now almost 2 years. So yes, we are in an extremely sluggish market for the spring. Now, you would assume that that's a good thing for buyers, but when you look at the actual average price, we're still up compared to when the pandemic first hit. And so with higher interest payments and higher prices, affordability is radically reduced, making it very, very difficult, not to mention the fact that now we have 2 million more people over the last 2 years that have immigrated to Canada. So demand is through the roof. Affordability is terrible. And it's Benjamin Tal's opinion that it shouldn't necessarily be this way. So is it time for interest rates to start getting cut by the Bank of Canada? Let's take a listen to Benjamin Tal explain what's happening and how this whole economy is on the brink.
We have a situation in which, if you look at overall GDP growth, is basically zero. Per capita, we are in a recession. Credit growth is basically zero. The last time we've been in zero was in the 1980s. The unemployment rate is starting to rise. Inflation is falling. What are you waiting for, the Bank of Canada? You should be cutting now. You have to realize that the Bank of Canada is a biased bank. You wake them up in the middle of the night and you tell them a recession versus inflation, they will take a recession any day. So a year ago, I told them, stop. You are overshooting already, but they went by another 50 basis points. And now they admit that it was a mistake. And we are paying the price because you cannot underestimate the price of higher interest rates, especially in this environment, especially now. You see, when you raise interest rates now, is much more powerful for two reasons. One is that this consumer, your clients, since COVID, was carrying no less than $165 billion of excess savings. Because, during COVID, people got those salaries, but they didn't spend. Their checking account got fatter and fatter. $165 billion of excess savings. So when the Bank of Canada early was raising interest rates, people say, you know what, I don't care. I'm spending this excess savings. I'm going to restaurants. I'm going on vacations because I have this money. This excess savings now is basically zero, which means that the consumer, your clients, they don't have the buffer anymore to protect them for the Bank of Canada. So the Bank of Canada is more powerful. That's one thing. The other, very important, is where inflation is coming from. Early during COVID and after COVID, 90% of the inflation came from outside the country, supply-driven inflation. The Bank of Canada is impotent in its ability to deal with it because, believe me, Putin does not care about the fact that the Bank of Canada is raising interest rates. So the Bank of Canada did not have the power to slow down the economy because inflation was coming from outside. Now, with supply chain back to normal, 90% of inflation is coming from domestically driven sources, sensitive to higher interest rates. So the Bank of Canada is more powerful. So by raising now interest rates, or even last year, you impacted the economy in a much more significant way. You see? So those are two factors that you have to discuss with your clients. Raising interest rates now or keeping them high now is more powerful and damaging the economy more than a year ago because of the increased sensitivity to higher interest rates. That's why I say enough is enough. You are overshooting already.
So yes, things are definitely not looking great for the economy right now. And the only way that we've been propping it up is using immigration, which if you've been watching my videos for the past year or so, that's exactly what I've been harping on. And all of this has been done to fight CPI inflation. However, when we actually look at the measurements for CPI and inflation as a whole, we see lots of different numbers.
Let's discuss inflation because I think it's really important to discuss it with your clients. Let's put it in perspective first. When I say inflation, when you talk to your clients about inflation, what do we have in mind? When you read in the newspaper, inflation, what is it? What is inflation? So first of all, let's remind ourselves that inflation is a rate of change. We all go to the supermarket. We are overwhelmed by how expensive food is, yeah? Crazy. The Bank of Canada does not care. Not because of the fact that they're not nice guys, they are. But because of the fact, listen to this, communicate. Inflation is a rate of change. It's not the level of prices. So if food prices went up by 10% last year, and today they're rising by 5%, still rising by 5%, that's disinflationary. It's not the level. The level does not enter the calculations. It's the rate of change, and they don't care how high the prices are. That's one thing. So this is something that the Bank of Canada is taking into account. Now, when we say inflation, we mean CPI, the Consumer Price Index. The target is 2%. Now, we can discuss, and that's another thing to discuss with clients. We can discuss until we are blue in the face. To what extent 2% is the right number? I believe it's not. We'll discuss later why. Never mind, they are not going to change it. You need like 500 PhD dissertations to change their mind. So we are stuck with 2% inflation. The CPI is the target, but of course CPI is very, very sensitive to food prices and energy prices that are jumping. So the Bank of Canada is looking at something called core CPI. CPI minus energy and food because it's less volatile. Fine. So we have two measures to look at. And then a few years ago, they came up with another measure. It's called CPIX, which is CPI minus other 8 components. And then 2 or 3 years ago, they came up with other one, CPI median, CPI trend, CPI component. They have 6 CPIs measured. Okay, listen to this. It's very important. Why? How do we measure the CPI? They say year over year. And then they say, you know what, year over year is too sensitive. Why don't we do 3 months moving average year over year? And then they say, who cares what happened a year ago? Let's do month over month. Let's do 3 months moving average, 6 months moving average. All of a sudden, you have 6 by 6 metrics. 36 inflation numbers when they release the numbers. 36 numbers, that's an inflationary buffet. Why is it important? Because listen to this, and this is something that you should communicate to your clients. When the Bank of Canada wants to be hawkish and say, we are going to raise interest rates, they can look at those 36 numbers and they can choose high numbers because there is enough there for everybody. If they want to be bearish and say, we are cutting interest rates, they are looking at low numbers. So it depends how they wake up in the morning. What I'm telling you here, and that's the message, the narrative is determining the data and not the other way around. It's not the data that is determining the narrative, it's the narrative that is determining the data. Today we got better than expected numbers. The Bank of Canada is now in the corner. They have to recognize that inflation is falling faster than expected and that they are overshooting. But they always can find numbers that are 2 or 3s in these 36 numbers, in this buffet, to justify no move. And that's more or less where we are. But inflation is moving in the right direction, and there's one more thing that we discussed last year, and it's even more now. Mortgage interest payments. The Bank of Canada is calculating shelter inflation, housing inflation, which is one third of the CPI. Shelter inflation. What is shelter inflation? It's not the price of houses, not there. It's commissions to real estate agents. That's part of the inflation, a small part of it. Rent, makes sense. And then listen to this, mortgage interest payments that are now rising by 30% a year. Now think about it for a second. That's important. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates, and discuss it with your clients. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates. Higher interest rates are adding to mortgage interest payments and therefore adding to inflation. You see how crazy it is? By the very fact of raising interest rates, you are raising inflation, although you are trying to basically fight inflation. Listen to this. If you remove, and by the way, Canada is the only country in the universe that is using mortgage interest payments in their CPI calculations. All the rest, it's not there. What happens if you remove mortgage interest payments from the calculations? After today's number, CPI inflation is 1%. It's undershooting the target. Enough is enough. You are overshooting with interest rates. I believe they should start cutting now, although they will not. Inflation is definitely under control.
So that's part of Benjamin Tal's take, and I'm going to do another video later on kind of describing things in a little bit more detail, but let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think it's time for interest rates to get cut, or do you think there are other solutions to the current problem we have with the housing market? Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.